Despite what's happened since his prime years, Chris Weidman will go down as one of the greatest 185-pound mixed martial arts fighters of all time. From his utter dominance in the very beginning of his career, to him dethroning MMA's most dominant champion in history, to his 3 straight title defenses over a trio of Brazilian legends, to his hefty fall from grace. Continue watching to learn about the career of former UFC middleweight champion Chris Weidman. Before I get into today's video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more resume reviews. Thus far, I've done them on Dricus Plessis, Magomed Ankalaev, Shavkat Rakhmonov, Bo Nickal, Anthony Johnson, Ilia Topuria, Sean O'Malley, Jack Della Maddalena, TJ Dillashaw, and now Chris Weidman. I'll link the others in the description below. Chris Weidman began wrestling at a young age, claiming a state championship while he was in high school before going to Nassau Community College in Uniondale, New York, where he'd become a 2-time All-American. He then transferred to NCAA Division I school Hofstra, also in New York, where he also became a 2-time All-American, placing 6th at Nationals as a junior, and 3rd as a senior where he'd take home the bronze medal in 2007. During this time, Weidman defeated both Phil Davis and Ryan Bader on the mats, Davis 5-4 and Bader 10-7. While attending Hofstra, Weidman met a man named Gabriel Toribio, who invited him to train at Matt and ncaa's Jiu-Jitsu Academy. Soon after, he'd win the East Coast Grappler's Quest, competing in his natural division of 88 kilograms, or 194 pounds, as well as the Absolute division, winning all 13 matches via submission where he'd qualify for the ADCC North American Championships, which he also won, taking home the gold medal in 2009 after only training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for roughly 1 year. Weidman also began his MMA career in 2009, having his first 2 fights inside of 2 months where he submitted 0-0 opponent Ruben Lopez with a Kimura and TKO'd 3-1 Mike Stewart, both finishes coming in the opening round. He'd win 2 more fights in 2010, claiming the ROC middleweight title via first-round TKO against 4-0 Uriah Hall, before defending it against 5-1 Valdir Araujo via 3-round unanimous decision. Now at just 4-0, Weidman made his UFC debut at 26 years of age against longtime promotional staple, 11-fight UFC veteran, 16-7 Alessio Sakara in March of 2011 at UFC on vs. 3. Sakara, of which had gone 4-1 over his last 5 with 3 knockouts. After a back-and-forth opening round on the feet that saw Sakara stuff all 3 of Weidman's takedown attempts, Weidman went on to secure his next 5 straight, beginning with a single leg at the start of the second. Weidman rained on some good ground and pound from top position before being reversed, where he soon after secured a double leg. Weidman secured another pair of double leg takedowns in the 3rd and final round on his way to a universal 30-27 unanimous decision victory, and we were just beginning to see how special of a fighter the New York native would become. His next fight came 3 months later against 21-7-1 Jesse Bongfeldt at UFC 131. Bongfeldt was unbeaten in his last 8 fights going in, and though he battled to a draw against Rafael Natal in his UFC debut and his fight previous, his 7-fight win streak that saw him enter the UFC showcased 3 wins over UFC vets. Weidman ate a big head kick early but tied up with Bongfeldt and secured a lateral drop immediately following. Bongfeldt eventually got back to his feet in the final seconds of round 1, Weidman of which threw and landed a knee to the body that Bongfeldt caught. Bongfeldt went for the takedown after catching the knee, where he was caught in and submitted with a standing guillotine choke at 4:54 of the opening round. Weidman made it to 3-0 in the UFC by the year's end, submitting Tom Lawler with a Darce choke at 2:07 of round 1 at UFC 139. Now at just 7-0, Weidman then faced top contender and former title challenger Demian Maia in January of 2012 at UFC on Fox 2. Maia, of which was 15-3 as a professional going in, including a 9-3 run in the UFC. This was a pretty back-and-forth affair on the feet, Weidman getting the nod in the striking totals 68-60, though he secured 4 takedowns on 6 attempts and stuffed all 7 of Maia's. Weidman certainly got tired in this one, but hey, he took the fight on 11 days' notice. By the fight's end, there were 3 29-28 scorecards, all in favor of Weidman, who secured the unanimous decision victory and by far his biggest win to date. It was originally scored a split decision, as one of the judges made a mistake and scored it for Maia, thinking he scored it for Weidman. This wouldn't be the only time a result of one of Weidman's fights changed after the fact. Nonetheless, this win got him a crack at an even higher ranked opponent in his first UFC main event against the last man to defeat Demian Maia previous to himself, 12-2 Mark Munoz later that year in July at UFC on Field TV 4. Munoz came into the bout on a 4-fight win streak, having gone 7-1 over his last 8 inside the UFC, with the only defeat coming to longtime top middleweight contender Yushin Okami via split decision. Munoz, like Weidman, was also a stellar wrestler, having become an NCAA Division I national champion in 2001, as well as a bronze medalist the year prior in 2000. He began his win streak with wins over a pair of fellow Division I studs in Aaron Simpson and CB Dalloway, before defeating Demian Maia, and then stopping Chris Lieben in his most recent appearance to date. With a win, he was presumed to be the next in line to challenge Anderson Silva for the middleweight title, but it was Chris Weidman that secured victory in one of the most flawless performances we've ever seen. Weidman secured a single-leg takedown early on in the contest and absolutely mauled Munoz. threatening with submission attempts from Kimuras to guillotines to mono-guillotines throughout the opening 5 minutes. Weidman went right back to the single leg once round 2 started, Munoz getting back to his feet about 45 seconds later. Once they were back to striking range, Munoz lunged in for an overhand right, being caught with a vicious counter right elbow that badly hurt him. Weidman followed up with some ground strikes for the KO win at 137 of round 2. Following this emphatic win, Weidman was ranked at number 1 in the division, and as such, he was next to challenge 33-4 Anderson Silva for his throne, who had just stopped Chael Sonnen in their rematch a week earlier. This happened 1 year after Weidman's fight with Munoz, 360 days to be exact, at UFC 162, as a result of an injury he was dealing with, as well as Hurricane Sandy, which completely ruined his home. Weidman secured an early takedown and, like he did in his UFC debut, showed off incredible, accurate ground and pound from top position before rolling for a leg lock, first attempting a knee bar and then a heel hook on the champion. The two were back to their feet at the midway point of the round, Silva beginning to pick Weidman apart on the feet while taunting him, but that feat really cost him in the second. Silva continued landing good strikes, but was too careless and got caught with a beautiful left hook at the end of Weidman's combination and was dropped. Weidman followed up with a couple more ground strikes to secure the KO win at 118 of round 2, and Chris Weidman was now the UFC middleweight champion at 29 years of age with just 10 professional fights. We all knew Weidman was capable of winning this fight. He was surprisingly only a 2-1 underdog going in, but when it happened, all of our jaws just dropped. Anderson Silva had been defeated. The man went 16-0 in the UFC up to this point with 14 finishes, 12 of those being world title fights, 3 being light heavyweight bouts, all 3 of which he secured first-round knockouts in, and the other being his UFC debut when he became the first man to ever stop the iron-trained Chris Weidman. The two were set for their immediate rematch 6 months later at UFC 168, where Weidman absolutely battered the former longtime champion. Weidman again secured an early takedown in the opening minute of the fight. Silva got back to his feet quickly and initiated a clinch, where Weidman dropped him with a series of right hands. He followed up with a barrage of strikes from top position and remained on top for the rest of round 1. Silva had some success with his leg kicks in their first encounter, and he went back to them once round 2 began. Silva threw a nasty inside leg kick about 70 seconds into the second, which was checked by Weidman, folding Silva's leg in half in the process, this time the fight being stopped via TKO at 116 of the round. Following back-to-back wins over arguably the greatest fighter to ever do it, Weidman made his second title defense against 21-4 former UFC light heavyweight champion Lyoto Machida that next summer at UFC 175. Machida had gone 4-1 over his last 5, only losing a disputed decision to Phil Davis in that time, and he'd gone 2-0 since moving down to middleweight with wins over Mark Munoz and Gegard Mousasi. This was an absolute war that showed us just what Weidman was made of. Chris controlled the center throughout the opening 15 minutes, landing a few good strikes here and there, and finally securing his first takedown of the fight in the final minute of the second. He secured another in round 3, landing heavy combinations once Machida got back to his feet. Weidman secured 2 more takedowns before they headed into round 4. Machida started to really tag Weidman up in the 4th, from a number of heavy punches to nasty body kicks, forcing him to go backward for the first time in the fight. Machida picked up in the 5th where he left off in the 4th, teeing off on Weidman in the early stages of the final round. Weidman landed a heavy right hand that backed Machida up, and soon after landed a thunderous right elbow that wobbled the Brazilian. It turned into a slugfest from here, until Weidman secured a takedown, remaining on top for over a minute. Machida eventually got back to his feet in the final seconds and unloaded on Weidman, but it was too late. Weidman ultimately walked away the victor via unanimous decision, the scoring totals being 49-45, 48-47, and 49-46, and he was still the UFC middleweight champion. There were 3 things about this performance that were incredibly impressive. For one, Weidman outstruck Machida on the feet 65-58, something no one expected. 2, he went 5 rounds for the first time, and 3, he showed off how durable he was during his peak. To our surprise, this would be the only fight of Weidman's career that went the full 25 minutes. Weidman made the 3rd defense of his title nearly 11 months later at UFC 187 against another former UFC light heavyweight champion in 24-10 Vitor Belfort. The Phenom had gone 6-2 since returning to the UFC, only losing to Anderson Silva and John Jones in title fights, with all 6 wins coming via finish, with his last 3 straight being knockouts over Luke Rockhold, Michael Bisping, and Dan Henderson. Chris survived an early flurry from the Phenom where Belfort was unloading on him with combinations along the fence, but the champion circled out and soon after secured a double leg takedown. He rained on some good shots from Vitor's half guard, before passing into Mount where Vitor gave up his back and was TKO'd at 2:53 of the opening round, and Chris Weidman was now 13-0 as a professional with a 4-0 run in world title fights. However, his reign as champion would come to an end sooner rather than later. Next, Weidman went into his 4th straight title defense against number 1 ranked former Strikeforce middleweight champion Luke Rockhold, who, following defeat in his UFC debut to a roided-up Vitor Belfort, had since won 4 straight with 4 finishes leading into his title shot with a record of 14-2. Chris would once again secure an opening minute takedown in this fight, immediately taking Rockhold's back following. Rockhold shrugged him off, where Weidman landed a nasty knee to the body and took him down again. Rockhold was taken down for a 3rd time before the referee stood them up, which was weird considering they weren't on the ground for long. Rockhold landed a nasty body kick once they returned to their feet, Weidman of which shot in on another takedown, but was out-scrambled and locked into a guillotine choke. He escaped it, but ended the round on his back. Rockhold stunned Weidman early in the second and got to work with his kicks immediately following, throwing him to the body, head, arms, and legs of Weidman. He also landed a good right hand about 3 minutes in and kept the fight on his feet throughout the round. Weidman did land a solid body kick that appeared to hurt Rockhold toward the end of the round, but he recovered well. Both men landed good exchanges in the third, Weidman seemingly starting to take the fight over through the opening 3 minutes of it, taking a page out of Rockhold's book and landing a lot of solid round kicks to the body. However, he went for a spinning wheel kick and ended up getting taken down and mounted. Weidman took so much damage in the final minute of round 3, it's insane. Rockhold absolutely battered him from top position, and Herb Dean didn't stop the fight when he probably should have. Rockhold put his foot on the gas in round 4, taking Weidman back onto the mat and TKOing him at 3:12 of the round, becoming the first person to ever take Weidman down, and also, of course, the first to ever defeat him. Weidman, now ranked at number 2, returned to the octagon 11 months later to face 11-1, number 4 ranked Yoel Romero at UFC 205, the first ever UFC event at Madison Square Garden in his home state of New York. Romero had gone a perfect 7-0 in the UFC with 5 knockouts to date, and he was undefeated at 185 pounds throughout his career. The former champion had a great start to this fight, landing a number of body kicks at will and also securing 2 takedowns on 3 attempts. After failing on his takedown attempt to begin the second, Weidman got back to work with his striking, while Romero landed a heavy body kick of his own and secured a beautiful foot sweep 3 minutes in. Romero controlled the remainder of round 2, taking Weidman down again at the end of it. After it was seemingly 19-19, or 1-1, going into round 3, Romero landed a flying knee from hell that KO'd Weidman just 24 seconds into the round, and Weidman had just lost his second straight fight. Now that Weidman had taken Romero's number 4 spot in the rankings and Romero had taken his, Weidman next faced number 5 ranked Gegard Mousasi 6 months later at UFC 210. Gegard of which came in with a record of 41-6-2. Weidman once again had a great opening round, securing 3 takedowns on Mousasi and also looking great on the feet. Mousasi got back to his feet each time he was taken down, but round 1 was a clear 10-9 for Chris. Mousasi had a strong start to the second, piecing combinations together on the feet before attempting a takedown of his own, eventually getting taken down again himself. Weidman passed over to mount before taking his back, Mousasi scrambling his way out as they got back to their feet. Weidman shot in on another takedown, where Mousasi landed a couple knees to his head, the action being stopped as a result. It appeared they were illegal strikes, but after viewing the replay, we were shown they were in fact legal, and Mousasi was declared the victor via TKO at 3:13 of the second. Mousasi is a former title holder of Cage Warriors, Dream, and Strikeforce championships across 2 divisions, and he eventually left the UFC on a 5-fight win streak to go on and become a 2-time Bellator middleweight champion. Following this defeat, Weidman had gone from 13-0 to 13-3, losing his last 3 straight, all 3 via knockout, the last 2 being in his home state of New York. Number 5 ranked Weidman returned 3 months later at UFC on Fox 25 to face number 8 ranked Ultimate Fighter 17 winner Kelvin Gastelum, who was 14-2 going in. Weidman looked great in this fight, out-wrestling Gastelum throughout each round, though surviving a knockdown late in the first. Eventually, after securing a 7th takedown of the fight in round 3, Weidman sunk in an arm triangle choke and got his first win in 2 years with a stoppage victory at 3:45 of the third, becoming the first man to ever stop Gastelum, who'd only ever lost 2 split decisions in his career previous. Back on the winning track, Weidman was now ranked at number 3, where he faced another former Strikeforce middleweight champion and number 5 ranked 25-6 Jacare Souza a year and a half later at UFC 230. This was a great fight between 2 former world champions, but it didn't have a good result for Weidman. Chris landed a solid right hand that momentarily wobbled Jacare about 2 minutes in, Jacare letting his hands go on some combinations as round 1 came to a close. After a back-and-forth second round that showed each man having success on the feet, they really started to throw it on in the third. Jacare of which landed a vicious overhand right that floored Weidman on the spot, KOing him at 2:46 of the third, where Weidman fell to 0-2 against Strikeforce middleweight champions. Nearly 1 year later, Chris returned to the cage at UFC on ESPN 6 to make his light heavyweight debut against number 4 ranked 11-0 Dominic Reyes. Reyes came out very aggressive in this one, as Weidman tried to counter his momentum with a takedown. After failing on his takedown attempt, the 2 got back to striking range, where Reyes dropped him with a counter left cross and followed up with a few ground strikes for the KO win at 1:43 of round 1. Now unranked at 185 pounds, Weidman next faced number 11 ranked Omari Akhmedov 10 months later at UFC Vegas 6. Akhmedov of which had 20 wins, 4 losses, and 1 draw going in, and went into the fight on a 6-fight unbeaten streak. After a grueling first and second round between these two, it was 19-19 going into the third, where Weidman mustered up the energy to take the Russian down and out-wrestle him throughout, winning the unanimous decision with the scoring totals being 29-27, 29-27, and 29-28. It certainly wasn't the Chris Weidman of old, and he was clearly tired following the second round. but he kept composed and went back to his wrestling, ultimately securing 5 takedowns while getting taken down 4 times himself throughout and outlanding Akhmedov 67-60 in total strikes. Back in the rankings at number 11, Chris went into the second rematch of his career when he faced number 9 ranked 16-9 Uriah Hall at UFC 261, breaking his leg with the first strike he threw, just like Anderson Silva did against himself in their rematch. This has got to be the most unfortunate, uncanny, and ironic thing I've ever witnessed in my 15+ years of watching this sport. Like, you really can't write this shit. After a long, grueling recovery period, Weidman returned over 2 years later to face 19-8 fellow longtime middleweight staple Brad Tavares at UFC 292. Though it wasn't necessarily a bad performance by him, it was certainly a spirited effort. He'd end up having a severely injured leg by the time it was over and lost the fight via unanimous decision, with all 3 scorecards going Tavares' way at 30-27. The first time Weidman ever lost a fight not via knockout. Though he was injured following this fight, it didn't take long for him to return again, as he came back last weekend at UFC Atlantic City to face 23-10 Bruno Silva. Weidman had a good start to this fight, landing a lot of body kicks before tying up with Silva and controlling him along the fence through much of the opening round. Weidman was momentarily dropped at the start of the second, but did a good job of evading most of the strikes coming his way throughout the first half of the round. As the round went on, however, Silva began to tag him up with a lot of heavy combinations. Weidman's chin held up though, and he had a strong finish to the second. Unfortunately, Chris landed a number of eye pokes in this fight, and after he dropped Silva with the check left hook in the third, the fight was stopped. Weidman declared the victor via TKO at 2:18 of round 3. However, the footage showed Weidman landing another poke just before the finishing sequence, thus the result was changed to a technical decision. Weidman still boasting the win that improved him to 16-7 as a professional. Silva had gone 17-1 across 18 fights from 2012 to 2021, though he came into the fight having gone 1-4 over his last 5. But, of his 23 wins going in, 20 came via knockout. He clearly wasn't the best in the division, but Weidman wasn't anymore either, so it was a fitting matchup for them to make. All in all, this was a dangerous fight for him that he did quite well in, outstriking Silva 88-30 across their 17-minute affair and securing a single takedown. Following the third defense of his title in May of 2015, Weidman has gone 3-7 over his last 10, which isn't the heftiest fall from grace we've ever seen, but certainly a sizable one nonetheless. Chris Weidman at his peak was a very special talent. A lot of people say he had a short-lived prime, and while that may have some truth to it, he was already one of the very best in the sport by the time he had just 6 or so fights. His rise almost reminds me of what Bo Nickal has been, coming to the UFC as a stud wrestler without much experience, yet excelling in the organization from the start. What Weidman did at 185 pounds from 2011 to 2015 is just remarkable. He was thrown to the wolves, always facing opponents with much more experience than himself, facing a 16-7 when he was just 4-0, and a 21-7 when he was just 5-0 for instance. And those aren't even the best fighters he beat. But he passed every test quite impressively. The Munoz fight couldn't have been more impressive. He outstruck Anderson Silva in both fights. He took him down in both fights. Not to mention, who the hell drops Anderson Silva from the clinch? Who tries to submit Anderson Silva? Anderson probably has the best clinch in MMA history. The most dangerous clinch in MMA history. And he's also a third-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he couldn't do anything to Chris. Another solid question, who initiates grappling exchanges with Demian Maia, a 4-time Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world champion that's widely considered the greatest grappler in MMA history? Chris Weidman did, and he did it multiple times successfully. Weidman is one of the greatest MMA grapplers to ever compete in the sport. He's obviously a great wrestler, and he took to grappling so quickly and was elite at it pretty much right from the start. He blended it all together so perfectly. I still have Anderson Silva as the greatest middleweight of all time, though Chris Weidman went 2-0 against him. And most have Israel Adesanya as their number 2. But to be honest, I think Chris would have given Israel some problems had they each fought in their prime. Just think of Israel's 2 fights with Marvin Vettori. Yes, Israel won both, the second quite handily. But if Marvin can take Israel down 4 times across 25 minutes, I think Weidman could have done the same and maybe even stopped him from top position. At the very least, not let him up. Weidman's pressure from top position was always so immense. He always enforced his wrestling very early in his fights, and his ground and pound is some of the most accurate in MMA history. Though he wasn't on top for as long as many of us predicted, Chris Weidman will go down in the history books as one of the greatest middleweights of all time. Where do you place him on your all-time middleweight GOAT list? That about does it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like and subscribe, maybe even tap the notification bell, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one.